So thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I don't know if I live up to what you just said. And I don't have a PowerPoint, and please forgive me, but I'm not guilty. So it must have convinced me that I should do very good about going. So if you have any questions about my PowerPoint, she took it away. It's just topic. Okay, today I will discuss how economic crises reshape migration patterns and challenge the traditional distinction between forced migration and voluntary migration. My case study focused on reciprocal migration flows between Angola and Portugal. The global economic crisis of 2007 to 2008 triggered new migration trends across southern Europe. Portugal was one of the countries most affected. Rising unemployment, low wages, austerity policies, increasing cost of living pushed many Portuguese citizens to seek opportunities abroad. Traditionally, Portuguese migration has been directed towards northern European countries, such as Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, France, and United Kingdom. However, during the economic crisis, Portuguese migration took a different distinct direction, and a significant number of migrants migrate to former colonies, particularly Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, became an especially attractive destination or this period. Sorry, I keep on looking at thing you heard about. Following the end of civil war in 2002, and the countries or Angola experienced rapid economic growth, largely due to the high oil prices and major infrastructure in reconstruction of the country. As many of you know, Angola is the second largest oil producer in Africa after Nigeria. And during this economic boom, created strong demand for labor and technical expertise. As a result, it's estimated around 200,000 Portuguese nationals migrated to Angola during this period. Then we can talk about in others and how they feel about. However, the economic growth in Angola slowed down significantly around 2015 following the decline in global prices. This led to rising unemployment in Angola and reduced opportunities for foreign workers. At the same time, Angola migration to Portugal increased significantly. Interestingly, the number of Angola migrants moving from Portugal today is higher than during the Civil War. So according to Africa Barometer, Angola migration to Portugal increased from 16,000 migrants in 2017 to around 55,000 in 2003, making Angola the second largest migrant community in Portugal after Brazil. The situation presented an important paradox. Angola no longer migrate primarily because of war, but because of the economic crisis and lack of opportunity. At the same time, Portuguese migrants to Angola often been framed positively as skilled expatriates, while Angola migrants in Portugal are frequently portrayed negatively or unskilled or economic migrant. Again, I'm pushing away what Iran said. Here would say is sorry, I'm pushing it away. This asymmetry reflects what Torino said this way of power geometry. The idea that mobility is shaped by the need for special relations of power. So my argument is that traditional distinction between forced migration and voluntary migration is often too rigid. Economic crisis can also propel migration, even in absence of war or political implication. These categories therefore obscure the complex ways in which crises reshape mobility and create movement in both directions. So then I'm talking about my research gaps. There are three research gaps that my study tried to address. So the first research gap is migration studies have rarely examined migration flows between Europe and Africa in both directions, particularly in relation to economic crisis. Most research focus overwhelmingly on African migration to Europe, and migration from Europe to Africa is often ignored or treated as significant. When European migration to Africa is discussed, it's usually framed in historical terms, in particular in relation to colonial expansion and settlement. This focus has led some scholars of ideas that migration study to the domain or centric, concentrate primarily on migration flows that directly affect Western Europeans while ignoring other important migration dynamics. By examining Portuguese migration to Angola and Angola migration to Portugal, this study highlights migration flows that challenge this dominant perspective. The second gap concerns the potential distinction between post-migration and colonial migration. In migration studies, post-migration is often associated mainly with war, conflict, and political persecution. However, economic crisis can also create situations where people feel compelled to migrate even if they are not being violent. In the case of Portugal, and economic pressures such as unemployment, austerity policies, and decline of economic opportunities play a major role in shaping migration decisions. As Oliver Beckwell said, notes whether migration is perceived as forced or voluntary often depends on which stage of migration process is examined and when the assessment is made. Therefore, migration should be understood as multidimensional rather than fitting neatly into fixed categories. The third gap concerns with comparison between European migration and African migration to Europe are still very radiate. Most comparative research focuses primarily on migration patterns within the global north. By comparing Portuguese migrants in Angola with Angolan migrants in Portugal, this study contributes to more balanced understanding of migration dynamics in both the contexts. So some of key results. The findings show that although both migration flows are influenced by economic crisis, the experience of migration were very different. Portuguese migration in Angola often benefit from better employment opportunity and higher social status. In many cases, colonial legacies shape perceptions of competence and expertise. For example, Portuguese migrants were frequently perceived as skilled professionals even when qualifications were modest. Some interviews suggest that in Angola, about one who claimed to be as an engineer in Portugal, but actually in Angola. He was an electrician in Angola, and in Portugal, when he went to Portugal, was an electrician in Portugal when he went to Angola, he engineered. So that's the difference. Oh, I had a person who, one of my interlocutor, she told me she was a teacher. I had a school teacher up here in Portugal, but when she moved from Angola, she became a university professor at the private institution. So, these perceptions are linked to what scholars describe as coloniality, where European knowledge and expertise continue to be very more highly than local knowledge. So, obviously, if you come from Portugal, people automatically assume that you know it all, yet all together. And that also applies to Portugal. When I go there, I say I come from Geo University, take me seriously. I say I come from Angola, I have to buy. Anyway, and in contrast, Angola migrants to Portugal often face structural disadvantage in negative stereotypes, even when they are highly qualified. On Angola interview, they explain that during professional meetings in Portugal, people sometimes assume that people are the janitor rather than consultant responsible for marketing business. This reflects what Dorilla Say calls space invaders, and again, I'm linked to what you said, where black bodies are expected to be in certain hierarchies or certain position. When they find themselves in positions of power, they are perceived like we said as below in that position. Again, these are good questions of gender, race, class, and historical relations of power, how migrations receive, or how workers receive and treat. Portuguese migrants are often welcomed in Angolas, are seen as professional skills, while Angola migrants were more frequently viewed as suspicious, were regarded as low skills. So now we come to what's interesting part, the challenge exists in research concepts. Obviously, I use a lot of, professionally, but you might be asking why would Portuguese will be going to Angola? What is the point of the European going to Angola? So I think at the beginning of my research, I had deep issues because people never took me serious. At a K1 professor from Sweden started doing the same research as me, and all of a sudden, as exactly one. So the theoretical framework that we're trying to work on is world system theory, obviously by Navalny, Arabi, the concept of core, periphery, and semi-periphery. Here I'm looking at how Portugal is positioned within this world system, and then I use the Lusophone migration system to understand how Portugal, because Portugal is a country that send migrants, also receiving migrants. And then I'm trying to look at how within the Lusophone migration system, Portugal is situated as attracting migrants from former colonies, also sending migrants to the colonies. So I have some methodologies challenge. So the first methodology challenge is that migrant interview in Portugal are sometimes less open about discussing the economic motivation behind the migration. So they will always refrain their migration experience when Angola as cultural development. They won't hardly say that, well, I'm going to Angola because I couldn't get a job in Portugal and I couldn't get the job in France for so the easier way was Portugal. They will always say, well, we came here to help, we came here to help. So the second sorry, this is my net. Also, sometimes the people to determine whether migrants the see will motivate self on economic crisis. Since migration choices are often influenced by multiple factors, including family aspiration, education, long-term career opportunities. That's so that just concludes 1 minute. This paper demonstrates how economic crisis can reshape migration pattern and blur the boundaries between post and voluntary migration. Portuguese migrants were often pushed to go to Angola by economic difficulties in Portugal, yet their migration was broadly described as forced. At the same time, Angolan migrants moving to Portugal to the economic crisis were often framed negatively as economic migrants. These contrasting narratives reflect broader power relations rooted in colonial history, race, global inequality. Ultimately, the case of reciprocal migration between Angola and Portugal shows that migration categories such as forced and voluntary migration are often too simplistic to capture the complex realities, nobilities, and times of crisis. Sorry, I'm too late. Sorry. Thank you so much.